Shalom and welcome to a new study of this fascinating book of Genesis. If you're here for the first time, I want you to know that you didn't come here by accident. And I encourage you to stay until the end of this video because without a doubt, today we will learn things together that we haven't heard before, and that includes me. My name is Eduardo Yosef, and today we are going to continue with our Genesis study series. This video is about diving into chapter 26, and today we are not here to read a story, but to discern a pattern. Because when you start to see patterns in the Bible, you stop reading stories and begin to understand how God acts. And that changes everything. In this chapter, we're going to see something that already appeared before, but now it's repeating. And not only does it repeat, but it goes deeper. And here's a key point I want you to take with you today. God works through patterns because God is a God of order, not of chaos, not of improvisation, but of order. And this is something powerful. Even the world, without wanting to acknowledge God, has had to admit this. Today, the most advanced science can no longer support the idea of a chaotic universe. On the contrary, it has discovered that the universe is full of structure, cycles, repetitions, and patterns. And then an uncomfortable question arises. If there is order, where does that order come from? And this is where that modern term comes in, intelligent design. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before. But look at what these people do. They recognize the design, but they avoid the designer. They accept the pattern, but they reject the source. And that's nothing new. That's exactly what human beings have done from the beginning. Now, let me tell you something that's important, especially if you study the Bible. Many, without realizing it, read the Bible with a humanistic mindset. And what does that mean? For example, they feel that everything has to be explained. That for every text you have to ask why, and if there's no logical answer,
Entonces,
and they dismiss it. But the Bible doesn't work that way. The Bible wasn't written to satisfy the rational mind. It was given to reveal the heart of God. And there are things that aren't understood but are discerned. And here comes something key for you, for those of you who are there on the other side. When you force the Bible to answer the question of why, many times you're missing out, or rather, you get lost. Much of what it has. But when you start to observe patterns, then you begin to understand how God moves. And that gives you a spiritual advantage, because God does not change. His ways do not change. His principles do not change. And that's why what he did before, he does again. And what we see in Genesis, you will be able to see in your own life. Listen to this. We live in a universe based on patterns. Why? Because it was created by a God of order. Nothing is random. Nothing is random. Everything has a design. Everything has a purpose. And when you understand that, you start to read the Bible in a completely different way. You're no longer just looking for explanations, but you start looking for patterns. And when you see the patterns, you can anticipate how God is going to act. And that's what we're going to start discovering in this study of Genesis chapter 26. So I encourage you to open your Bible, and we're going to read this entire chapter from beginning to end. From verse 1 to 34, it says the following. Afterward, there was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. And the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land that I will tell you. Live as a foreigner in this land, and I will be with you. And I will bless you, for to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will confirm the oath that I made to Abraham your father. I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the sky, and I will give your descendants all these lands. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring, because Abraham listened to my voice and kept my precept, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Isaac lived in Gerar, and the men of that place asked him about his wife. And he replied, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," thinking that maybe the men of the place would kill him because of Rebekah, since she was beautiful in appearance. It happened that after he had been there many days, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looking through a window, saw Isaac caressing Rebekah, his wife, and Abimelech called Isaac, and he said, "Look, she is certainly your wife. How then did you say, 'She is my sister'?" And Isaac answered him, "Because I thought perhaps I might die because of her." And Abimelech said, "Why have you done this to us? Someone from the people might have slept with your wife, and you would have brought sin upon us." Then Abimelech commanded all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man became rich and prospered, and he grew until he became very powerful. And he had flocks of sheep and herds of cattle and many servants. And the Philistines envied him. And all the wells that the servants of Abraham his father had dug in his days, the Philistines had stopped up and filled with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you have become much more powerful than we are." And Isaac left there and camped in the valley of Gerar and lived there. And Isaac reopened the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham, his father, which the Philistines had stopped up after the death of Abraham. And he called them by the names that his father had called them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of living water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water is ours." That is why he called the name of the well Esek, because they had quarreled with him. And they dug another well, and they also quarreled over it. And he called its name Sitnah, and he moved from there and dug another well. And they did not quarrel over it, and he called its name Rehoboth. And he said, "Because now the Lord has prospered us, and we will be fruitful in the land." And from there he went up to Beersheba. And the Lord appeared to him that night and said, "I am the God of Abraham your father. Do not be afraid, for I am with you, and I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of Abraham my servant." And he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there, and the servants of Isaac dug a well there. And Abimelech came to him from Gerar, and Ahuzath his friend, and Phicol the captain of his army. And Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, since you hated me and sent me away from you?" And they answered, "We have seen that the Lord is with you, so we said, 'Let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have only done good to you and sent you away in peace. You are now blessed by the Lord.' Then he made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. They rose early in the morning and swore an oath to each other, and Isaac sent them away, and they parted from him in peace. On that day, the servants of Isaac came and brought him news about the well they had dug, and said to him, 'We have found water.' And he called it Seba. For this reason, the name of that city is Beersheba to this day. And when Esau was 40 years old, he took as his wife Judith, daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they were a source of bitterness of spirit to Isaac and to Rebekah. Now, to understand the depth of this instruction, we have to remember something important. Isaac, he is not making a decision in a vacuum. He is living within a promise that had already been established with Abraham. God had already defined a land, a territory, and an identity for that offspring. And within that framework, Egypt always appears in the scriptures as a human way out. That is to say, Egypt represents a logical, visible, and immediate way out, but it doesn't necessarily represent the will of the covenant. That's why, when God tells Isaac not to go down to Egypt, it's not just a geographical instruction, it's an instruction to remain in the place of the promise, even when the conditions seem to contradict all of this. And this is very important because here a principle is revealed that is repeated throughout absolutely all of Scripture. God's promise does not always, and listen carefully, eliminate the pressure of the environment, but it does redefine how we respond within that pressure. Isaac is at a critical point because from a human perspective, everything pointed to moving. Famine, instability, risk, everything around him was telling him, get out of here. But the voice of God is telling him something completely different. Stay. And this is where the spiritual tension of the chapter begins, because obedience doesn't always feel logical in the moment. Isaac has to make a decision whether he's going to interpret reality only by what he sees, or if he's going to interpret reality by what God has already spoken about that land. This isn't just an old story. It's a pattern that repeats itself regularly. Every time God establishes a place of promise, a period of pressure is also established within that place. And the temptation is always the same: to leave before the right time. In the text, we see that God not only tells Isaac what not to do, he is also reaffirming where he should stay. Because remaining in the promise is not passivity, it's sustained obedience in the midst of uncertainty. And this sets the stage for what comes next in the following chapter. Because the way Isaac responds to this instruction will determine not only his survival, but also the development of the blessing that God had promised to his family. What does this mean exactly? Listen carefully. Although we are further along in the unfolding of God's plan of redemption, we have a broader vision of how everything has been revealed throughout all of Scripture. There is still much more to come. And therefore, there are still aspects that remain mysterious. You could say they remain a mystery. In the book of Genesis, in chapters 48, 49, and 50, more information is added that, while it clarifies the bigger picture, also deepens the understanding that not everything has been fully revealed. As for how all the nations of the earth will be blessed through the descendants of Abraham, it's important to remember something key. The word nations in biblical language doesn't mainly refer to territories, but rather to people. We shouldn't confuse our modern use of nation as a synonym for country. In the Bible, it doesn't always work that way. The term nations generally refers to groups of people, including structures of leadership and their rulers, for example. Now then, Isaac obeyed just like his father. Abraham heard the voice of God and did what he was commanded, but Isaac also carried with him a trait that was very similar to his father's, and that was fear. In the midst of the famine, which was happening in a land where they didn't feel completely safe, Isaac experienced this insecurity. And as a result, another familiar pattern appears. The difficulty in being completely transparent, especially regarding his wife. Without a doubt, Isaac knew his father's stories, Abraham in Egypt, and now. In some way, he repeats that same behavior. He tells the inhabitants of Gerar that Rebekah is his sister, just like his father had done. Until one day, Abimelech observes, looks through a window, and sees Isaac in an intimate situation with his wife Rebekah. And at that moment, what had been a rumor is completely exposed. Abimelech understands the truth, confronts Isaac, and he admits his deception. The furious king issues a clear order. No one is to touch Rebekah, under penalty of death. Probably a lesson he had already learned from his previous encounter with Abraham. Now, although here we see patterns that clearly repeat in the life of Abraham, the results in Isaac's case are different. They're distinct. They're different in another way. Abraham faces a famine, and he decided to go to Egypt to survive, and he did. Isaac also faces a famine and considered going to Egypt, but he didn't go. Abraham introduced Sarah as his sister. The Philistine king ended up taking her to his house. Isaac introduces Rebekah as his sister, but the Philistine king doesn't take her. Instead, he discovers the truth and protects the situation. It's even interesting. It's worth noting something else. Every time Abimelech refers to Isaac's God, he does so respectfully, using the divine name. He says, Yud-He-Vav-He, Jehovah. This shows that Abimelech not only knew Isaac's God, but also feared him. And that fear directly influences the decisions he makes regarding Isaac and his entire clan. Now then, in verse 13, we remember that there was a kind of prolonged famine there that led Isaac to plant crops. Probably as a supplement to provide for his family and all the herds he had. This is consistent with the practice of shepherds. In the ancient world, it was common to supplement livestock raising with small crops to support the family economy. This does not indicate an intention to settle permanently, but rather a survival strategy within that context. And that's where we're seeing something really important. God blesses Isaac precisely in the place where he decided to obey and stay. And those blessings are extraordinary. Why? Because the text says that the harvest produced 100 times what was sown. At that time, agricultural methods were primitive and the normal yield was limited. A good harvest could be 25 times what was sown. A 50-fold yield was considered a good year. A 75-fold yield was exceptional. But 100 times, it was beyond what is natural. A harvest. At that level, it can only be understood as divine intervention. And the result is clear. Thank you. Isaac's wealth begins to grow continuously. And as a consequence, the Philistines, the locals, begin to experience strong envy. Now, it's not just economic envy. There is also fear. Fear of the God of Isaac. And fear because of the size of his clan, which is growing and also becoming stronger. Isaac, in that context, stops being just a foreigner. He begins to be perceived as a significant and potentially threatening presence within the territory. This scenario will be repeated over and over again in the history of Israel and later in the history of the Jewish people. Because God's blessing upon them in the form of abundance of food, longevity, fertility, and wealth also became a reason for envy and persecution by the peoples with whom they lived. Here we see a first expression of that tension. The Philistines, driven by that envy and frustration, began to close and fill up the wells of water. And this is not a minor detail because water in that context was vital for the survival of Isaac's clan. It's important to remember that these wells were not new. They had been there for years. The clan had dug them years before. Now then, the Philistines turned against Isaac's clan. The Philistines had grown considerably. They were numerous, strong, and represented a significant presence in the region, to the point that the Philistines began to perceive them as a threat. And in that context, Abimelech makes a decision. He asks Isaac to withdraw from the area, to withdraw from his land, but here we must understand something important. This is not a scenario where the strong expels the weak. It is actually a situation where the weaker tries to displace the stronger. Isaac at that moment had the ability to resist. There could even have been an armed conflict, and Isaac would probably have had the advantage. Because in those kinds of ancient dynamics, Abimelech understood perfectly well that he couldn't directly confront this expanding clan. Therefore, the logical thing would have been to negotiate, establish coexistence agreements, and share resources. Isaac knew this, however, he chose another path. Instead of confronting, he decides to move. He gathers his clan and moves toward the region of the valley of Gerar, the Wadi, the seasonal riverbed. That is where he begins to do something tremendously significant. He starts to reopen the wells that the Philistines had filled with earth. And when the water starts to flow again, conflict arises once more. The Philistines claim that the water belongs to them. And once again, the tension is reignited. In response to this, Isaac makes another decision. He gets up and moves with his clan to Beersheba. And it's interesting to note that Abimelech, acting as a pragmatic politician, understands something very clearly. And he understands something that is wiser to seek: reconciliation. With this group that was, let's remember, growing before they became an unstoppable force. That's why he decides to renew the covenant that had been established years earlier with Abraham. Now then, Beersheba means 7 wells, or the well of the 7. And this place was not unfamiliar to Isaac. It was a place with a lot of historical significance for his family, since Abraham had settled there after the event of the sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Moriah. Do you remember that story? Therefore, Isaac is not entering unfamiliar territory. He is returning to a familiar place with history, with memory, with meaning. We also need to understand something very important. Beersheba is not a city at that time, but rather just a kind of oasis. A place of water, of life, of provision in the midst of the arid desert surroundings of that area. There was no city there until that moment, and it would be a long time before a city was established in that place. And the later name of the city actually takes the very ancient name that Abraham had already given it. Starting from verse 23, when Isaac takes his large family to Beersheba, something key happens. God appears to him again. The text says that Jehovah appeared to Isaac, using the same Hebrew expression, va'ira, which is commonly used to describe many of God's communications with the patriarchs. Isaac had just gone through a very difficult time. He was probably feeling frustrated. He even had a sense of failure because he had left a territory without putting up a fight. Even though God had said that land would belong to Abraham's descendants. And in that context, Jehovah appears to him as a comforter and says, "Do not be afraid." Why does he say, "Do not be afraid"? Because Isaac was afraid. Pardon the redundancy, that is, at that moment, Isaac imitates his father and builds an altar. He offers sacrifices, and Jehovah, he orders, or rather, Isaac orders his men to start digging a new well. Something absolutely necessary for the survival of the clan. And while they are digging, something unexpected happens. Abimelech arrives, accompanied by his chief of staff, Ahuzat, and the commander of his army, Phicol. Isaac reacts with anger. His response to Abimelech could be summed up like this, "And now what? I did everything you asked me to do to keep the peace between us, and yet you're here again." But Abimelech doesn't come with the intention of conflict. He comes with a different attitude. He comes with an outstretched hand, seeking a peace treaty. Isaac is settling right on the edge of Abimelech's influence. That is, the borders of Egypt as well. And Abimelech perceives something very clearly. That he has pushed Isaac as far as he could, but even so, he still feels safe. Now then, Isaac probably understood perfectly well why Abimelech was there. Simply because of the company he brought with him. Because if Abimelech had come to make war, he wouldn't have brought his chief civil officer or his usual entourage. This kind of entourage was typical in formal negotiations between kingdoms, not in wartime. And the nature of the agreement is made clear in verses 28 to 30. To live together in peace. The covenant is sealed in the usual way for that time, with a ceremonial meal and oaths invoking the deities of each party. After this, Abimelech and his group withdrew. And on that same day, something significant happens. The men who were digging the well find water. In the ancient world, this is always interpreted as a sign of favor, provision, and blessing. And there is no doubt that the text presents this as an action directed by God, peace, prosperity, and new opportunities. All of this begins to open up for Isaac. Life starts to become stable, but even so, the story is not over yet. Because in the midst of this time of blessing, a new family challenge arises. The issue is that his son Esau, impulsively and without consideration, does exactly what Isaac and Rebekah feared. He takes Hittite women as wives. And here the text reminds us of something important. God had already established his purpose long before. Because 40 years earlier, in his sovereignty, he had determined that the line of the promise would go through Jacob, Esau's twin brother, even when both were still in their mother's womb. When we get to the end of Genesis 26, we begin to see the full picture. It's not just the story of Isaac moving from one place to another. It's the revelation of a much deeper principle. Because what is repeated here is not a coincidence. They are patterns. And those patterns show us how God guides, how God protects. And how does God uphold his promise? Even in the midst of pressure, conflict, and uncertainty. Isaac? He's not perfect. He's not a man without fear. He's a man who obeys, but who also struggles internally with insecurity, with the pressure around him, and with the reality of what he sees with his natural eyes. And even so, God remains faithful. Throughout the chapter, we see something constant. When Isaac stays in the land, there is provision. When he faces conflict, there is direction. And when there is external pressure, God makes a way. And when there is uncertainty, God reveals himself again. This leaves us with a very clear lesson. God's promise does not eliminate the process, but it does guarantee his purpose. The wells that are opened and closed, the conflicts with the Philistines, the relocations, the peace treaties, all are part of the same narrative. A narrative where God is shaping Isaac, but he is also establishing the territory of the promise. At the end of the chapter, we see something very important. Isaac does not conquer the land by force. He does not take it by war, but he inherits it through obedience, perseverance, and dependence on God. And that shows us another dimension of God's character. God not only fulfills promises, God shapes people who are able to bear those promises. Why? In this chapter, we are not seeing an ancient story, but rather we are looking into a mirror because it reminds us that many times God's process includes staying when we want to run away, to yield when we want to fight, and to trust when everything seems uncertain. Even so, in each of those moments, God is present, guiding, reaffirming, and making a way. Genesis 26 then leaves us with a very clear image. A man still in process, a person still developing, and a God who does not abandon his word. This is where we finish our study of chapter 26. Next week we will be starting chapter 27. I hope this has been a blessing for you. And that you have been able to learn, but above all, that God has spoken to you through this study we have had today. If you allow me, as always, I will pray in priestly Hebrew. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you. May he have mercy on you, and may he give you peace. God bless you. See you next week. Remember, all of you who want to go deeper into the scriptures to study more, that those studies are not here on YouTube. You can go to the lanacademia.com website, and there you can continue studying. If you don't have a place, if you're new, you don't know where to go, you don't know where to turn, or you're simply at home and you're not receiving any training, and you want to belong to a group, we have house groups in different parts of the world, in different cities, so we invite you to be part of one of them. For that, visit the website bosisdisrael.com, and there you'll find information about where. We have some of the houses where groups of brothers are studying the scriptures in person, also with guidance from us, from here, from Israel. Also, as you already know, we continue with our trips to Israel, our trips to Turkey, and our trips to Greece. For that, go to the website descubriendoisrael.com. Very well, that's all for now. Thank you for joining me. God bless you. Have an excellent and blessed day. Shalom.